Oxford University Museum of Natural History is home to an internationally significant natural history collection, including the first dinosaur fossils to be scientifically described and the only surviving soft tissue from a dodo anywhere in the world. But it is also one of the most remarkable buildings of the Gothic Revival, a treasure house of Victorian sculpture and design. My name is John Holmes. I am Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Birmingham and an Honorary Associate of the Museum. Over this series of podcasts, I want to introduce you to the art and architecture of Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and to give you a virtual tour of this extraordinary and beautiful building. So far in this series, we've looked at how the art and architecture of the museum was designed to teach its visitors and students about science. The museum's Gothic style and the angel above its main entrance told them that, in Victorian Oxford, science was the study of God's creation. In this last episode, I want to look at how the museum responded when this conception of science, known as natural theology, came into conflict with the new evolutionary and revolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin. When Oxford University agreed to build a museum of natural history in the mid-1850s, the scientists who had campaigned for it reassured the other dons that this would be an overtly Christian enterprise. Not everyone was convinced. In high Anglican Oxford, suspicion of science remained high. In May 1855, a month before the foundation stone was due to be laid, a last-ditch attempt was made to stop the building of what one popular pamphlet called the Babylon of a New Museum, in an allusion to the personification of sin in the Book of Revelation. The dons who warned against the dangerous materialism of science may well have felt vindicated 5 years later, when the museum celebrated its opening by hosting the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The British Association meetings were large public gatherings, drawing in crowds of amateur as well as professional scientists, and anyone else interested in new knowledge and the development of scientific ideas. On the 30th of June 1860, several hundred people gathered for a debate on the validity and implications of the theory of evolution by natural selection, which had been proposed by Charles Darwin at the end of the previous year in his book on the origin of species. The meeting was held in the large reading room on the first floor of the museum. The room has since been partitioned by a mezzanine, but the original painted ceiling remains, giving a sense of how grand and imposing the architecture must have been. The great debate, as it has come to be known, has been much mythologized. Darwin himself was not present. According to popular legend, the leading antagonists were Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, known as Soapy Sam for his habit of wringing his hands together while he spoke as if he was washing them, and the rising naturalist Thomas Henry Huxley. Wilberforce notoriously asked Huxley if he had any particular predilection for a monkey ancestry, and if so on which side, whether he would prefer an ape for his grandfather and a woman for his grandmother, or a man for his grandfather and an ape for his grandmother. Huxley's reply to the bishop's smutty joke was that, if the alternative were given him of being descended from a man conspicuous for his talents and eloquence, but who misused his gifts to ridicule the laborious investigators of science and obscure the light of scientific truth, or from the humble origin alluded to, he would far rather choose the latter than the former. A report of the debate in the little-known local paper called the Oxford Chronicle and Berkshire and Buckinghamshire Gazette, discovered by the historian of science Richard England in 2017, shows that this exchange certainly took place, much to the enjoyment of a rather raucous crowd, though there were many other speakers for and against Darwin, and the debate was far from a simple clash between science and religion. Wilberforce was a bishop, not a scientist, but he spoke for many scientists nonetheless, including several of those involved in building the museum, when he questioned Darwin's ideas. And Huxley was not attacking religion per se, but the subordination of scientific inquiry to Christian revelation that was implicit in natural theology. What was at stake here, then, was not just human evolution, but the whole question of what science was: the study of God's creation, or a method for investigating the properties of a material world. The great debate initiated a conflict at the museum between natural theology and methodological materialism, or scientific naturalism as it came to be known. This conflict played out in the museum's science, but also in its art, and in a growing tension between the two. The angel above the door to the museum is a clear sign of the museum's initial commitment to natural theology, while the only hints at Darwinian evolution in the early carvings at the museum are equivocal at best. One of the windows, carved by James O'Shea in the spring of 1860, around 6 months after Darwin's book was published, features some curious grotesques. Unlike most of the carvings at the museum, these are not actual animals but hybrids, the forequarters like those of a large carnivore, the hindquarters an eel-like tail. The most likely explanation is that they are an allusion to a notorious passage in The Origin of Species, where Darwin imagines that over time natural selection might turn a species of bear that swims around with its mouth open, catching insects, into a creature as monstrous as a whale. The suggestion to include them was probably made to O'Shea by either Henry Acland or Charles Daubeny. Both of them were Oxford scientists who worked on the construction of the museum, and they were both sceptical towards Darwin, at least initially. Acland and Daubeny shared O'Shea's mischievous sense of humour, and the Oxford bear whales seemed more like a parody of Darwin than a homage to him. There's another joke, perhaps at Darwin's expense, perhaps at Huxley's, perhaps even at Wilberforce's, in the central court. In the next bay round, from a carving of a monkey puzzle, are two decidedly puzzled-looking monkeys. They look like they've been repurposed from a sketch that James O'Shea did for some carvings of monkeys round a window, which may have been the original design for what became the cat window. The architectural historian Frederick O'Dwyer suggests that O'Shea was probably back carving in the central court by mid-August 1860, so he may well have added these monkeys as a direct reference to the debate, which had taken place in the museum only a few weeks before. If the museum's initial response to Darwin was parody, it did change its tune. The older natural theologians retired or died, while Acland and his younger colleagues, such as the anatomist George Rolleston, soon came to see that the best way to sustain both their faith and their science was to distinguish them from one another, rather than to look to nature to corroborate religion. By the 1880s, the museum had abandoned natural theology and become instead one of the leading centres for researching and teaching evolution on the principles of scientific naturalism. There was, however, one recently appointed professor at the museum who held out against Darwin. In 1869, John Ruskin, who had been actively involved in the design of the museum in the 1850s, was appointed the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford University. Throughout the 1870s and for another brief term in the 1880s, Ruskin taught art at Oxford, principally lecturing in the museum itself. Ruskin was appalled by the materialism of Darwin's theories. For him, they reduced human morality and the God-given beauty of the world to mechanical processes of survival and sex. Ruskin wanted the museum to celebrate life, but its displays of skeletons and human skulls, including specimens of genetic deformities, seemed to him to call to mind death and disease instead. He increasingly hated the methods of science too. Having championed art and science together in the 1850s, he now declared that portraits of great men and even pictures of ducks and drakes could teach more than the scientific collections in the museum. Ruskin resigned his professorship in 1884 in protest against the use of vivisection in scientific research at the museum which he had helped to found. 15 years later, a statue of Charles Darwin, carved by Henry Hope Pinker, was unveiled at the museum in the central court, only a few feet away from O'Shea's teasing monkeys. Almost 40 years after the Great Debate, Oxford University Museum of Natural History had at last made its peace with Darwin. It honoured him publicly in the way that its founders had always honoured science, through art.